Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 18th chapter in the book of Luke. Here we read of two parables in succession pertaining to prayer. The first is instructive as to the quantity of prayer, whereas the second one is instructive to the quality of prayer. Now, parable demands definition, and one of the advantages of writing a book is you always have resources. You don't have to write a book, just write your thoughts, because personal revelations as they come to you can be lost. And there's a lot you can say when you write words as opposed to speak extemporaneously. So in the book, which is Who is My Neighbor, an extensive commentary on the parable of the Good Samaritan, also unique to Luke's account, also a parable. So in that book, I define parables are instructive illustrations that use familiar imagery of incidents from nature or everyday experience as analogous examples to illuminate new didactic truths in a more lifelike manner than is possible by explicit precept or general abstraction. So something like that I'm not going to stumble into. I'm less likely to stumble into extemporaneously. And it does serve its purpose for this extemporaneous discourse, in that the parables, now to various extents, the parables were wrapped in mystery, and the meaning of them are not necessarily as self-evident from one to the other, but these two are very much straightforward. So we have to understand that the parable is also, I write, parables were the most efficient platform through which the master could communicate his truths to his disciples while keeping them hidden from his critics. Now, in the second one, he is especially critical of the Pharisees. There can be no mistake in who it's pointed to. So these ones aren't veiled in too much mystery. These are rather straightforward as far as parables are concerned. So we just want to understand what types of parables we're dealing with before we approach the text itself, which we're going to do now. The opening verse reads, "And he spoke a parable to them that they should always pray and not lose heart." Now there's a parallel passage, 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Paul admonishes them to pray without ceasing. So it's really consistency and repetition. Prayer should be, at minimum, for spiritually immature people, at least a once-a-day endeavor, either when you wake up or when you fall asleep, bare minimum. But throughout the day, as you spiritually advance, the more inclined you will be to pray as an instinctive reaction. Even when you don't need anything, you have cause to be grateful and to thank the Father for all that he has done for you, and not to lose sight of the blessings when we're in the midst of that blessings, because the danger of prosperity is that we neglect the source of that prosperity, and we become spiritually empty, if not financially so. Saying, "In a certain city there was a certain judge, not fearing Elohim, nor regarding man." The judge thus described is not a righteous man. He's not a qualified judge. He's the archetypical corrupt judge, which sadly infiltrates many judicial systems. So we have to understand that he's not an ideal judge. He's the caricature of the corrupt judge. "And a widow was in that city, and she came to him, saying, 'Do right to me on my adversary.'" Now, the city is unspecified because it doesn't matter. These characters aren't named. They're just alluded to in types. And widows were... Now, theoretically, Israeli society was supposed to be mindful of the most vulnerable among them, be they strangers, orphans, or widows. And widows in first century Israel really had no legal recourse, because they couldn't a woman couldn't stand for herself in court, and have the absence of a husband meant she had no legal representation. So she's not approaching this judge through the traditional legal protocol. She's essentially badgering him at his door, and the judge, being an unrighteous man, is naturally pestered by this. "And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, 'Even if I do not fear Elohim, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I shall do right to her, lest by her continually continual coming, she wears me out. So he wasn't motivated by any altruism or benevolence. He was simply pestered to death, for lack of a more relatable analogy, to complying with the widow's demands. At first, he didn't want to hear her. He didn't want to let alone accommodate them. But because she badgered him so much, he eventually relented on his resolve to he's not going to be naturally inclined to execute justice, especially when he's off duty. And this widow probably couldn't afford the bribe, because we can take it that this was the type of judge who would have been inclined to accept bribes, which is tragically commonplace in the history of any civilization. And shall Elohim not do right by all means to his own chosen ones who are crying out day and night to him and being patient over them? So there's a contrast between the unrighteous judge and Elohim, who is the conceivable body of moral perfection. He loves us, he cares for us, he wants to provide for us, and he wants us to acknowledge the provision and to pray for him, whether we receive the provision or not. We're to constantly call on him because he longs for companionship, whereas this judge was just someone who didn't want to be bothered, but he was bothered sufficiently enough to bother to help the one who was bothering him. But so everything that he does, now prayers may not be answered immediately, but they are always answered in his timing, and every prayer of the saint, inasmuch as they have the right to call themselves that, when they're praying, they'll be aligned or conjoined with the will of the Father, because the purpose of prayer is not to dictate our desires to him, but to align our desires with his will, to know his will and to have the courage to enact that will, and the discernment to know, and to be more like him. So we pray, as we worship, we become. So the act of prayer really causes us to lean on a perfect vessel, and his perfection is vicariously imputed to us for its proportionate purposes. I say to you that he shall do right to them speedily, but when the Son of Man comes, shall he find the faith on the earth? So this is an allusion to his second coming. Now, he generalizes in saying that they're going to get an immediate response, but the truth is often we don't get our prayers answered in the ways we expect or in the timing that we would want them to. But everything ties into the second coming, and the question is, shall he find the faith on the earth? So we are to pray for thy kingdom come. That's to bring the kingdom in whatever infinitesimal dose we can to the earth, in preparation for that exalted and final day. And the second parable is beginning in verse 9, ends in verse 14, and the 9th verse reads, "And he also spoke this parable to some who relied on themselves that they were righteous in looking down on others." So the target audience in mind is what is known as self-righteous people, and these are particularly prominent in any religious community. The fact is, because people observe certain standards that society at large does not impose on themselves, can engender spiritual pride. It ought to humble us if practiced in the way that religion was intended to be. It wasn't to draw walls between the religious and the world, but to draw the world to the religious. And self-righteous is a repellent barrier which prevents many people from coming to the faith. And the Pharisees were very much the personification, the living personification of the self-righteous religious practitioner. These were the people whose authority was generally uncontested at the synagogue level, and they observed the minutiae of the Mosaic law and even made it more detailed than it was originally prescribed. They had books this big just on what one could and could not do on Sabbath day, for instance, and that was a source of other controversies between him. But he was generally mutually antagonistic to the Pharisees. they had it out for him because he exposed their hypocrisy, he dismantled their delusions, and ultimately he undermined their authority. So often the parable was necessary because the Pharisees were and scribes were forever seeking some pretext through which they could indict him according to Jewish or Roman law. So the parable was the literary device which allowed him to very often wrap his truth in mystery, which often he would explain to in private after the